This week on The Sceptic, I speak to Dr. Mike Jones, political scientist and migration expert, on the shameful history of Britain's grooming gang scandal.
Most likely it began in the late 1980s, but it could have come back much further, possibly to the 1970s or even to the 1960s. What happened in the UK mirrors what you'd expect to see in a war zone or in the aftermath of a conflict where, occupying forces prey on the civilian population.
And Poppy Coburn, assistant comment editor at the Daily Telegraph, on how activist so-called experts have waged a campaign to deny the racial element to the grooming gang's abuse.
A few years before the Home Office report comes out, Dr. Ella Cockbain releases a report which tries to debunk this narrative of Muslim grooming gangs. It was pretty shocking to me that this person, who is highly respected by people in the British establishment, is pushing such a nakedly politically biased view of an incredibly serious crime.
And for our premium subscribers, I'm joined by journalist and Sceptic regular Ben Pyle on the dodgy politics of environmental and social governance, ESG, and why a major green finance initiative just collapsed.
Trump has been quite vocal about his belief that climate change is a scam. So there's going to be more skepticism and there's going to be more scrutiny of ESG and the things that were really championed by the Biden administration.
If you're not already a donor, make a donation of at least £5 a month for the Daily Sceptic, log in with the same email, and you'll find a link to the premium version of the podcast on the homepage, including instructions about how to listen to it on your favourite podcasting app. Donors will also be able to access articles behind our paywall and join our discussion threads on Discord, where you'll have an opportunity to discuss the latest Daily Sceptic content with other donors, members of the editorial team, and some of your favourite contributors. You can access all this bonus content for as little as £5 a month. Just go to dailyskeptic.org/donate. Now, on with the show. Now, when people talk about the grooming gang scandal, which was shot into the news this month, that phrase is to some extent a euphemism. It doesn't fully capture the horror of the rape and sexual torture of thousands of underage girls in Britain over many decades by Muslim men from the Middle East, East Africa, and South Asia, predominantly Pakistan. Abuse has taken place across more than 50 towns. Several victims have been murdered by their abusers. And for fear of being called racist, authorities failed to investigate the crimes. It's a story that's so shocking that for far too long, far too many in our media and political class have felt it easier to look the other way than face the stark reality. But in fact, it's precisely because of the horror of this story that it needs retelling. And to do that today, I'm very pleased to be joined by Dr. Mike Jones, who's a writer, a political scientist, and a migration expert, and formerly the executive director of Migration Watch. Welcome to The Sceptic, Mike.
Hi, great to be here.
Good to have you here. Okay, so this is a phenomenon that's been around for a long time, and many people will have heard a bit about it, but I think it's fair to say perhaps not enough about it. And so I think it's worth really retreading the whole issue here. So to begin with, Mike, when and where did this grooming gang scandal start?
Well, the grooming gang scandal refers to something very specific. It refers to paedophile gangs, mostly made up of British Pakistani men, targeting and abusing predominantly young white girls. The girls were mostly between the ages of 11 to 15, often from unstable or underprivileged backgrounds, broken homes, struggling families, foster care, or, children's homes. Now, the atrocities took place in towns, cities and villages across England. It happened in places like Oxford, Telford, Newcastle, Rochdale, Rotherham, Halifax, Manchester, and Bristol. About 50 areas were affected in total. Now, Jack Straw, former Labour Home Secretary, referred to the victims as easy meat, not to be dismissive or derogatory, but to convey the way in which the groomers viewed their victims. They saw them as subhuman, lacking any moral worth or value. When did it start? Most likely it began in the late 1980s, but it could have come back much further, possibly to the 1970s or even to the 1960s. We don't know for sure, but what we do know is this. It went on for decades. It was systematic. It followed a clear pattern of grooming. Thousands of girls, possibly tens of thousands, were raped. It was industrial in scale, And by and large, it was mostly British Pakistani men torturing and raping young white girls. Not exclusively, but predominantly so.
And it's this interesting phrase, isn't it? Grooming gangs, because that does refer to a quite specific phenomenon, but it is often criticized as being not really strong enough, because in fact what's happening here is children are being raped, and that these are therefore rape gangs. And so, I mean, just tell us a bit about what's happening with this on-street grooming.
Well, grooming is a general term. It describes a process by which young children are seduced with gifts and personal affection and then brought into a seedy world where they're desensitized to sex through role play or conversation. They are then manipulated, often with the help of drugs and alcohol, before being raped and raped repeatedly. And from there, it only gets worse. Typically these girls are passed around the grooming gang like, pieces of meat in an abattoir. They're then exploited like livestock, used to generate profit for the gangs, who then pimp them out to their clients. It's important to remember, though, that the groomers aren't just masters of manipulation. They're also skilled at psychological intimidation and physical violence. They threaten not only the girls themselves, but the girls' families. And yes, people have died, such as Lucy Lowe and her family in Telford. Girls are routinely beaten, imprisoned, and tortured. This is why many people, as you say, take issue with the term grooming, because it downplays the sheer brutality and depravity of the crimes. And honestly, it's hard to argue against that. What happened in the UK mirrors what you'd expect to see in a war zone or in the aftermath of a conflict where, occupying forces prey on the civilian population. And that's what makes the grooming gang scandal so deeply shocking. It's not what you expect in a civilized, law-abiding country like the United Kingdom.
So you refer there to the case of Lucy Lowe, and that's a particularly shocking one, but not everyone will have heard about it. Mike, tell us about Lucy Lowe.
Well, Lucy was exploited by a gang member when she was 12 years old. Lucy was legally incapable of consent, and that's also one of the reasons why she was targeted. She became pregnant, she gave birth to a child, but Lucy died in a blaze along with family members, and she was actually pregnant the second time when she was killed. And the perpetrator was obviously jailed for life for this.
And so just to be very clear there, that's one of the grooming gang itself who had already raped her, who burnt down her house and killed her and her family. I mean, it's just unbelievably appalling.
Yeah, the perpetrator was called Azza Ali Mahmood. He was then 26 and he killed Lucy when she was, I think, 16, as well as a 17-year-old sister and mother, Aileen Linda Lowe, who was 49. I think he was jailed in 2001. I
mean, it's so shocking. And just tell us about some of the other terrible individual cases that people might not have heard of, but should have.
It's hard to pick the worst individual cases because there are so many. We'd need hours to go through them all, but there are two that always stand out to me. The first case involved a young girl from Oxford, and it's one of those rare cases where the full grisly details were released to the public, not just a sanitized summary in a newspaper. The case comes from the sentencing of Mohammed Kara in 2013. According to the judge, Mohammed used a contraption, a pump, to prepare the child's body for a gang rape involving 5 men. Why a pump? All I can say is Google it. If you really want to know the details, I'm not going to repeat it here. But during the ordeal, a red ball was placed inside the girl's mouth to stop her from screaming. Pure and mitigated horror. The second case is from Oldham, and this is so twisted, so dystopian that some people can't bring themselves to believe it. Basically, one night in Oldham in 2006, a 12-year-old girl called Sophie entered a police station and reported that she had just been molested in a graveyard by a man named Ali. Now, a desk officer told Sophie she was drunk and not to come back until she was sober and accompanied by an adult. After this, two men accosted her in the police station, and then joined by a third man, they raped Sophie in their car outside the police station. And it doesn't stop there. The rapists dumped her on the street, and Sophie, completely traumatized and hysterical, asked a man named Sawa Ali for directions. Ali took Sophie into his house, raped her, and then gave her money for a bus back home. But there's more to it than that. A man named Shakil Chowdhury pulled up in his car and offered to take Sophie home. He then abducted her and took her to a house dubbed the House of Horrors in the newspapers, where he and 4 other men repeatedly raped her. I mean, what do you say? What can you say? It's pure and mitigated horror. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. Girls were sexually abused with broken bottles and baseball bats. Some were doused in petrol and threatened with being set alight. There were lots of beatings, forced injections of heroin, and lots of sexual injuries, with some requiring surgery.
And so you alluded to one of those cases there, one of the girls going to the police and essentially being brushed off and told she was drunk and to come back later. And this is part of a long pattern with the police, with social workers and authorities generally kind of ignoring this, and at times even going so far as to cover it up. I mean, just tell us about that, Mike.
Oh, make no mistake, there was a culture of cover-ups, complicity, and a conspiracy of silence. When people talk about bureaucratic failure, they often say the fish rots from the head, that everything starts falling apart because of poor leadership at the top. But when it came to the grooming gang scandal, the fish wasn't just rotting at the head, it was rotting everywhere. The gills, the dorsal fin, the tail. It was total, unambiguous systemic failure. And that word systemic is crucial, because what we witnessed wasn't just isolated incompetence or a handful of bad decisions. It was a failure of the entire structure from top to bottom. Here are a few examples. Okay, first up, there's Laura Wilson. Laura was just 17 when she was stabbed by her abuser, a man called Ashtiak Ashgar. Her body was dumped in a canal, and she was labelled the first white victim of an honour killing. But here's the truth. A review by Rotherham Council found that Laura had actually been groomed and abused by British Pakistani men from a young age, and she'd been failed by 15 different agencies that were supposed to protect her. And what did the council do? They censored the report. Then they threatened a High Court injunction to block uncensored extracts from being published. Why? Because they wanted the story to be about an honour killing, not the fact that Laura had been groomed and abused. They buried the truth. Elsewhere, the authorities didn't just fail the victims, they actively humiliated them. For example, a 12-year-old child was offered lessons in Punjabi and Urdu so she could communicate with her abuser. In Telford, agencies actually blamed the children for the abuse they endured instead of holding the rapists themselves to account. I mean, in another case, police officers caught a grooming gang abuser in the act next to their station. He was performing a sex act with a teenager. They caught this man, Banaras Hussain, red-handed, but what happened? Nothing. The abuser told the coppers what he was doing, and the police politely drove away. Now, Banaras Hussain was eventually locked up for abusing children as young as 11, but guess what? He was released last month. He served only 9 years of a 19-year sentence. And it gets worse. Police officers let groomers hand over children in exchange for walking free. The police told parents, they couldn't act because of racial tensions. And in some cases, the police actually arrested parents or threatened to arrest parents who tried to rescue their own children from sexual abuse. And to top it all off, social workers were involved in this cover-up as well. When a child in Bradford married her abuser in an Islamic wedding, her social worker actually attended the ceremony, and then the council arranged for the girl to be fostered by the abuser's parents. I mean, you couldn't make it up. Now, my view on this, based on the evidence I've seen, is that the police, the social services, and local authorities were institutionally biased, but against the non-Muslim population, which is strange because, historically speaking, nation states tend to discriminate against minority groups, not the majority. And indeed, that was the case in Britain up until very recently. But today we've gone from one extreme to another, where authorities actively punish non-Muslim children and their parents, whilst letting ethnic minority grooming gangs run amok. This is two-tier policing, plain and simple, and it's done in the name of anti-racism, which is the biggest irony of all.
And it's absolutely sickening, this idea that you'd put the blame for it on the girls who are being abused and their families as well. And there was a way of thinking that almost at times mixed with the misogynist and anti-white ideology of the abusers, which is that Western girls are sexually licentious in some way and therefore were somehow asking for it. So illustrate for us a bit more the way that the blame for this, far from being put on the abusers themselves, was put on the girls and their families.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, parents who raised the issue with the police claiming their children were being abused were accused of racism. I mean, some police officers even said that the families should be grateful that their children were having a new cultural experience. Whistleblowers, instead of being praised for what they were doing, were actually put on, diversity courses. It was completely insane. There was just a culture of denial and basically covering up the abuses that were taking place. It was a complete and utter systemic failure from top to bottom.
Okay, so you mentioned the denial there, and obviously this is coming to light more widely recently, but evidence about it did start to trickle in the noughties. Tell us a bit more about the history of that.
Well, the turning point came in 2003. That was the year Labour MP Ann Cryer first spoke out about young girls being groomed outside school gates in her constituency. Her reward, accusations of racism from a party, along with threats so severe she had to wear a panic alarm. But Cryer was a trailblazer. Her warnings caught the attention of Andrew Norfolk, a journalist at the Times. Now, Norfolk initially covered Cryer's story, but didn't dig deeper for years, partly because of what he called liberal angst. It wasn't until 2010 that he decided enough was enough and started investigating properly. And what Norfolk found was shocking. Grooming gangs, predominantly British Pakistani men, preying on white girls in places like, Manchester, Rotherham and Rochdale. But just like Cryer, Norfolk ran into major pushback. I mean, but Bernardo's a children's charity, no less, told its staff not to speak to him. And even when reports were published, both locally and nationally, there was resistance from councillors and civil servants trying to depoliticise the issue. That being said, media coverage has improved over time, especially on TV. I mean, GB News, for instance, deserves a lot of credit. Their former presenter, Mark Stein, he dedicated a lot of airtime to interviewing survivors of grooming, giving them a platform to share their stories. And, let's not forget Charlie Peters. His documentaries really helped shed light on the scale of the problem.
So in the past 10 years, there has been some government attention being paid to this in the form of inquiries, but there's questions as to whether they've been comprehensive enough. So, tell us a bit about how comprehensive they were.
Well, basically, most of the inquiries are of a local nature, and obviously local authorities don't have the legal powers or the wherewithal to dig deep. Some of the national inquiries that have taken place, such as the Casey Review and the J reports, they're not specifically focused on the whole grooming gang phenomenon. they either look at particular case studies or parts of the country rather than looking at the phenomenon as a whole.
And so the government this week has been repeatedly pointing to the IICSA sexual abuse inquiry and saying that this was a broad inquiry into sexual abuse and therefore that we didn't need another one. But in fact, there's precious little references to the grooming gangs in that. For instance, in 500 pages, it mentions Rotherham only once. I mean, so there's not really enough in there about the grooming gangs, is there?
No, there isn't. I mean, generally, I'm pretty skeptical about inquiries. They're often expensive, drag on for years, and can end up, hijacked by interest groups. But in this case, I'm willing to make an exception. The horrors in each of these towns deserve their own deep dive and their own reckoning. You've got to remember that many of these girls were trafficked between towns by their abusers. So a piecemeal approach isn't going to cut it. As the civil service might say, what we need is a joined up approach. Only a national inquiry specifically focused on grooming gangs can provide that. Previous reports such as the IICSA, which you mentioned, and the Casey Review are too broad in scope and only focus on specific towns or case studies. That said, I don't think you can rush this or try to do it on the cheap. You can't cut corners. It's going to be expensive and it will take a lot of time. But honestly, this is so important that we shouldn't even be thinking about price tags. It's just got to happen. Now, is an inquiry on its own enough? No, it isn't. Before an inquiry is set up, we need to take bold action on immigration, both legal and illegal. The Human Rights Act, at a minimum, needs to be amended to remove any reference to the European Convention on Human Rights. This will make it easier to deport illegal immigrants from countries deemed unsafe by the human rights establishment. At the same time, the government must deport every foreign national offender released from prison, including those with dual nationality. Every foreign groomer should be kicked out of the country. It's a disgrace that immigrant groomers in Rotherham are still living here and living the life of Riley, often in close proximity to their victims. On top of that, we need new laws to hold public officials accountable. If you're in a position of power and you turn a blind eye to abuse, or worse, if you actively cover it up, you should face criminal charges. No excuses, no exceptions. As for legal migration, we need caps and higher thresholds on family visas and worker visas. The British government needs to put an end to chain migration from the developing world, especially from places like Somalia, Kashmir, and Afghanistan. A lot of these countries are not culturally aligned with the UK, and you have lots of very sort of clannish communities there that are quite patriarchal. Cousin marriage is quite common in some of these communities. And I think large-scale immigration from these countries poses a great national security risk to the UK.
And so in terms of the political response to this issue and also that issue of denialism, so the grooming gangs have come roaring back into politics this week. And on Monday, Keir Starmer was giving a speech and he was asked about it. And he came out with this extraordinary phrase, which was saying that those who were calling for an inquiry, which, by the way, includes survivors of the abuse, were jumping on a far-right bandwagon.
When politicians, and I mean politicians, who sat in government for many years, are casual about honesty, decency, truth, and the rule of law, calling for inquiries because they want to jump on a bandwagon of the far right, then that affects politics.
I mean, Mike, what did you make of that?
I'm disappointed with Sir Keir's response, to put it mildly. He's ruled out a government inquiry into child exploitation in Oldham, and now he's ruled out a national inquiry. Now, any Labour MP that defies him on this will have the whip removed. That's a strong statement, and of course it's tone deaf. out of touch with public sentiment, and it gives the impression of a state-sponsored cover-up. Now, Labour claim that a national inquiry is not needed because there's already been a smorgasbord of local inquiries. But as I pointed out earlier, you need a joined-up approach, to use that buzzword, and local authorities don't have the power or the wherewithal to dig as deep as a state body. As for Secur's comment about bandwagons, righteous causes, whether it's related to the Grenfell disaster, Hillsborough, the Windrush scandal, they all start off as bandwagons, but in many cases they're justified. And the grooming gang scandal is arguably the greatest scandal in post-war Britain, and I'm glad there's a bandwagon, and I hope the Labour Party are put under immense pressure.
And so I suppose one more thing on the Labour Party then. So we've seen Jess Phillips become involved in this row this past week because Elon Musk, proprietor of Twitter, has made some mean comments about her on Twitter, or X as it's now called, about her responsibility for the scandal. And she is, of course, the Minister for Safeguarding and Violence Against Women and Girls. So this is her brief, and she has blocked an inquiry on this. And now she's hitting back against Musk, or in fact, making a big song and dance about this whole thing and presenting this as a misogyny issue against her, and then talking about online criticism and how it's made her feel unsafe and things. I mean, Mike, surely the real misogyny issue here, it's not about Jess Phillips, it's about those girls who were abused.
Yeah, precisely. The priority is the welfare of the grooming gang survivors. Sunlight is the best disinfectant, and we need the truth out there. We need the inquiry. The welfare of young girls is paramount, not the ego of Jess Phillips. Now, I appreciate Jess has done some excellent work in this area in the past, although she has made controversial comments, particularly on incidents in Germany, for example. But I don't think the attention should be on Jess Phillips's hurt feelings, because ultimately there's been a decades-long cover-up of sadistic abuse, and I think our attention should be focused more on that than on Jess Phillips's spat with Elon Musk. And at the end of the day, she's an elected politician. She calls the shots, and she rejected an inquiry into the grooming gang abuse in Oldham, and she didn't really justify it. And I think whatever criticism comes her way is justified.
And so finally, do you have a sense of what's changed about the political landscape that's meant that this issue has come to the fore in a way that it hasn't in years previously?
I think a lot of the frustration with the grooming gang scandal was bubbling under the surface, and it's been there for years. But I think the political parties have tried to depoliticize it, partly by not talking about it, and partly by not linking it to immigration policy. I mean, there are some exceptions here. I think Rishi Sunak, to his credit, was quite strong on this. But generally speaking, there was, almost a cross-party consensus not to talk about this too much. But that's completely changed in the last couple of weeks. I mean, basically, transcripts of the abuse in the Oxford case were retweeted online, and they went viral. And Elon Musk, being the proprietor of X, he took an interest in this and retweeted those transcripts, and it created this cascade effect, this firestorm, and a lot of that frustration that's been there for many, many years came up to the surface, because it's the greatest scandal in post-war Britain. And the political scientist Matthew Goodwin, he did an analysis of newspaper articles using a fancy online search engine, and he found that the grooming gang scandal wasn't mentioned as often as more fashionable causes like, Black Lives Matter and Grenfell and, various other causes. And I find that really, really staggering. There's been a sort of concerted effort almost to keep this under wraps. Of course, the media do cover it, and the Times newspaper in particular have been excellent. But when they do cover this scandal, it's often through gritted teeth. It's as though they force themselves to do it. I mean, Charlie Peters was recently in court for the conviction of a groomer, but he was the only broadcast journalist there in court. Charlie Peters works for GB News, and I just find that absolutely astonishing. But the political landscape has almost certainly changed now, and the grooming gang scandal is being tied to the immigration issue. It's being tied to the notion of two-tier policing, and two-tier policing does exist. We know this from the J report. So it's really moved the goalposts of political debate, and I think the Labour Party are in for a rough few years.
Okay, well, Mike Jones, thanks very much for coming on The Sceptic.
Thank you.
Now, you've heard there how concerns about political correctness serve to stifle necessary action on the grooming gangs for years. Indeed, at times, instead of the horrific abuse of the gangs being dealt with, those sounding the alarm about it, including the victims and their families, found themselves smeared as racist. In fact, one of the reasons the liberal left have proven so keen to sweep this issue under the rug is that there was indeed a racial element to this abuse, just not the kind we're supposed to talk about. When GB News' Charlie Peters describes this as the biggest race hate scandal in 21st century Britain, the kind of racism that he's talking about is anti-white. And to discuss that, I'm very pleased to be joined by Poppy Coburn, assistant comment editor at the Daily Telegraph and a writer for publications including The Critic. Welcome to The Sceptic, Poppy.
Hi.
Okay, so let's start with one of the key aspects of this scandal that often gets overlooked, and that's the role of race in it, and in particular of anti-white racism. And so we do often hear comments about, well, maybe it's the fact that they were working class, maybe it's a misogyny thing, maybe there's a religious element to this, and it's the fact that they're kuffars, so they're non-Muslims. All of that may have played a role, but I think the role of race is key here. So, for instance, white slags, white bitches, and white girls were terms used throughout this abuse. And if we take one particularly loathsome character as an example, that's Shabir Ahmed, and he was the leader of a Rochdale rape gang. And when he sat in court for his crimes in 2012, he came out with comments including, "We are the supreme race, not these white bastards." And just another detail to throw in, he worked for the Oldham Pakistani Community Centre. So, Poppy, illustrate for us the significance of race in all this.
Yeah, I mean, so this whole conversation coming up about grooming gangs, a lot of it does feel like we are going over the same situation that happened in 2011, which is when the Andrew Norfolk Times stories first start coming out. And the aspect that's always immediately contentious in this case has been the racial aspect, which is why people have spent so much time trying to play it down. And as you just mentioned, there are very clear cases of a racial, what would legally be considered in any other context, a racially aggravated offence. So, for example, if you were calling someone that you are gang raping a white bitch or a white slag, when you were standing up in court and you are making reference to your own ethnic background as a reason why you are superior, and the ethnic background of the people that you have allegedly gang raped as being inferior to you, there's clearly a racial element. So just on the basis of not even looking at the statistics of who's been carrying out these rapes, it's coming from the horse's mouth itself. People who are actually engaged in these crimes will say pretty openly that there is a racial reason for why they are doing it. And that is really significant, even more significant than I think the class factor, which obviously isn't mentioned. There's certainly a class factor in the way that the police deal with it, but isn't mentioned by the perpetrators themselves in the way that explicit racial aggravated element really is. But to get to the statistical side of things, so when this is first reported, again, back in 2011, when it really hits the mainstream press, what Andrew Norfolk described it as is predominantly ethnically Pakistani males attacking predominantly ethnically white females. And that is just true. That is borne out in some of the early investigation research for it. There's a specific term for this, which is group child sexual assault. That's a specific category. And of the people who are committing assaults under this category, it is about 80% ethnic Pakistani heritage. That is just ethnic Pakistani, by the way. There are some rings that are, so in Bristol, for example, the child abuse sex ring there is Somali. In, I think, Oldham, it's predominantly Bangladeshi. So it isn't just the Pakistani heritage, but there is definitely an element here of Asian or Muslim males, whatever like ethnic grouping you want to give it, targeting white females with a specific cultural element to this. An idea of cultural inferiority. So, before we get into anything else, you cannot sidestep the racial element of this at all. Purely on the criminal basis of it, it is clearly a racially aggravated offence. To kind of look back a little bit and look out at the wider picture of why this is racially significant, while there is the racial element should be spoken about, this also ties into how the British state deals with race relations. And that's a long, long story, okay? That's going all the way back to the post-war settlement, when you first have Commonwealth immigrants settling into the United Kingdom. And the official response of the British government at the time, whether the ruling party be Labour or Conservative, is the way to maintain good race relations in the country is to keep immigration to a relative minimum, and to not talk about racial affairs. They are petrified very early on because of some early riots, so the Notting Hill riots, for example, the Brixton riots, initial Brixton riots. They see this as a fear of a heavy-handed policing response and a perception of a two-tier racialised justice. And that terrifies the British establishment. And they in many cases rightly believe the way to deal with that is to not really talk about racial disparities and work really, really hard not to have a perception of treating ethnic minorities differently to the white British population. Now, again, you can say that these aims are, make sense. You don't want race riots going on in your country. There's also an element where immigration is kept very low because there's a fear that these tensions will always exist. But there's also this early kind of post-empire toxic strain of the way we deal with race relations is by community management. And so that is the outsourcing of policing, not to the actual British state itself, which should be sovereign. It should be the police who are making these decisions. But a fear that because the British police may be seen as racist, that it will be outsourced to community groups. So a community leader would be the person expected to look after their own community and to have some sort of relationship with the police themselves. Some people have compared this to a millet system. That's not entirely true because there is obviously no white British community leader. It only applies to non-white British groups. So I don't think that's a perfect analogy. But I suppose specifically for the groups that the British state was targeting, yes, that does kind of apply. So on a broader level, this is significant because the British state is not colourblind. It does take into account different ethnic groups and polices people accordingly. And I think what's been really shocking and distressing about this case, particularly to international viewers, is basically seeing that the British state will treat white British victims differently from ethnic minority victims, and not in the way that the popular anti-racist narrative has had it. Actually, when it comes down to it, if there is such a thing as systemic racism, it is not always being applied to ethnic minority groups. It is actually being applied against the white British minority in the case of these grooming gangs.
And so you mentioned race relations there in the post-war period. And of course, the Race Relations Act in 1965, what that brings into British law is this idea of stirring up racial hatred. And this is quite a much more vague offence than our previous ways we've understood criminal speech that's inciting. That started then, and nowadays that's evolved all the way into people going to prison for posting things online that are a bit politically incorrect, essentially. So there's this instinct there that where there are racial tensions, the best way to solve them is to clamp down on speech. And one of the ways this has manifested itself is in this Home Office report into child sexual exploitation that you've been writing about, that came out in 2020. And what this essentially did was to downplay massively the racial element in the grooming gangs and really to obfuscate the fact that it was there at all. And so, just tell us a bit about that and how that was done.
Yeah. So there's been a lot of talk about inquests in recent days. We have had inquests before. This is really the biggie. This comes out, as you said, in 2020. It's this big Home Office report, which takes about 7 years to compile. It's far from perfect, but it's the first really nationally cohesive report that is looking at group child sexual assault, which does take into account some, not all, instances of these grooming gangs operating across Britain. This report is problematic for quite a few reasons. Firstly, the report itself says that data is not particularly good. So again, coming back to this ethnicity question, a lot of police forces across the country just don't record the ethnicity of people who are committing the crimes, which then allows the authors of the report to say, well, it's imperfect data, so we can possibly speculate on whether or not there is a trend here in certain ethnic groups preying on a different ethnic group. Ergo, we're not going to look into it, really. There are some other slightly more contentious terms that are used here. So, and I think that the way to understand this research is that it's not just all being done independently. It's not all fresh research. Some of it is actually leaning on the work of other independent researchers. And this is something I've kind of written about in the past. There is one woman called Dr. Ella Cockbain, who is an academic at the University College London. And she's been specialised in this subject of grooming gangs for quite a few years now. She's been writing about it for quite a long time. And her findings are quoted pretty extensively in this Home Office report. In fact, there's even a Guardian write-up of some of her initial findings. And I think the headline is something along the lines of, Home Office report finds that there is no Pakistani connection to grooming gangs, or finds that white people are just as likely to commit this form of group child sexual assault as any other group in society. And so I was really interested in this because it's a lot more complicated than this, and there is some data which completely contradicts that narrative. So I thought I would do a little bit of digging into who Dr. Ella Cockbain is. She's obviously a respected academic, but who is publishing her work? And where does she kind of get this data from? How does she come to these findings? And what I found was she originally comes to these conclusions in a report that was not written for the Home Office, but for a group called the Institute of Race Relations. Now, the Institute for Race Relations, we're going down a bit of a rabbit hole here, but I think is relevant. It's quite an interesting organisation. It's a pretty good look into post-war Britain and how post-war Britain sees the question of immigration and ethnic cohesion. So it's set up by proper British establishment figures, a friend of the editor of the Sunday Times, a lot of kind of grand old lords, some people who had served in the British Empire and Burma. It is so establishment to its core. And it purports to take a purely neutral grounds of how do we make sure that there are not race riots in the United Kingdom? How do we make sure that the United Kingdom stays a cohesive, happy country? And then around the 70s, it starts to get a little bit strange. So this is pretty common at the time. A lot of the conventional left is getting thrown out with old communist organisations, or it's becoming disillusioned with explicitly electorally political organising bodies, and instead it kind of slips into civil society bodies. And the Institute of Race Relations is one of these bodies that is essentially taken over by self-described Marxists. Even a lot of the funding that this group receives turns out to come from a lot of KGB front groups. So it's a very interesting process that makes you sound a little bit mad when you talk about it, but it is all true. And after this, it becomes a lot more explicitly political. So this is no longer just looking at data, fact-finding, speaking to people about how their lives are being affected. It is now doing things like promoting disgraced academics who denied the war crimes of the Khmer Rouge, and promoting people who are going around shooting white people for their race on the grounds of kind of Black Panther-style revolutionary Black Marxism. So this body, after that, again, professionalizes in the 1990s, becomes something that the Blairite, regime can kind of deal with. It cleans itself up, it gets rid of some of the more cranky people involved. But I would stress that this is still very much not a mainstream body. It is really not getting its funding from a nice little old lady who's jangling a little collection box saying, please, donate to the Institute for Race Relations. It is receiving money from large charitable trusts. It is unknown by basically every person in Britain that you could possibly think of who is not working within that very, very small sphere of civil society. But so it does have a slightly more professionalised veneer, but it is still very much a radical organisation. And a few years before the Home Office report comes out, Dr. Ella Cockbain releases a report co-authored with another academic from Nottingham Trent University, who also has the same research focus, which tries to debunk this narrative of Muslim grooming gangs. And there is a scatter quote over all of that. She takes issue with the term grooming gangs, and she certainly takes issue with Muslim being attached to it. And so I read the report. It's actually longer than the Home Office report. I wouldn't say it was particularly, influential. It wasn't really picked up by the media. Obviously, it did later influence this Home Office research, but it was, it's not really a popular report. And in it, the authors kind of quite systemically try and muddy the waters on what the reality of the situation on the ground is. So without really using any data analysis whatsoever, they make assumptions that misinformation is being promoted by neoliberal right-wingers across the continent. They claim that disinformation is circulating on social media. There is a massive section, it's about 5,000 words long, that is just talking about the far right and how the perception there is a racial or ethnic element to these crimes may embolden the far right, which of course is totally irrelevant. It doesn't matter what the second order effects of reality are. It's important that, we just say this is reality and this is what's going on. And then when it does get to the kind of quantitative analysis, it basically just says the same thing the Home Office report says, which is, well, the data is imperfect, so we may as well not use it. And that is just not that is not good enough. If you are a serious researcher, you would either try and do your own research, or you would try and make the data as usable as possible, even in limited circumstances, and acknowledge that it's not perfect, which is what was done in other smaller cases like the Telford inquiry and the Rochdale inquiry, where they do find an absolute overrepresentation of Pakistani men who are perpetrating these crimes in these instances of group child sexual assault. And so it was pretty shocking to me that this person who was highly credentialed, who seems on the surface to be someone who is highly respected by people in the British establishment, is pushing such a nakedly politically biased view of an incredibly serious crime, crimes that are still being perpetrated now, with what seemed to me a pretty obvious agenda here. I mean, just even the use of these constant buzzwords about the far right, disinformation, neoliberalism, it is very much like the sort of thing that you would expect to read in like a left-wing trade magazine, And I found it very surprising then that this is what the Home Office was getting its data from and was using to back up its findings. That to me said immediately that this is not actually a clear reality of what's going on the ground.
So people like Dr. Ella Cockbain are being treated by the establishment as experts here. And obviously one of the big suggestions this week has been that there should be another inquiry into this. But what does that say, the fact that Ella Cockbain is treated as some kind of authority on this, as to whether the conclusions of such an inquiry would be sufficiently robust?
We don't need another inquiry. I really can't put that into words enough. I mean, having an inquiry along with other much stronger actions being taken, like retroactively. I mean, we did this after the Stephen Lawrence murder, actually changing precedent to deal with the case more harshly. If you would like to retry some of the perpetrators who got a 2-year sentence for gang raping a child, if you would like to try social workers who were complicit and police officers who turned girls away at the door when they were trying to record a crime being done against them, fine. But an inquiry in and of itself is just woefully insufficient. And again, we can see this because to a certain extent, the left and right, we have had inquiries. They've not been particularly good. I wouldn't say they're particularly high quality. And they haven't looked in depth at every town that has been afflicted by these grooming gang problems. But the findings have never really been strong enough, even if they were implemented, to actually prevent these crimes from happening again. I do not think we need a minister for children. I do not think we need to use it as a different hobby horse for banning people from using social media. I think this is a classic example of when you lean on civil society and you expect these people to do the grunt work for you of dealing with these deeper societal problems. They are just going to put on their own hobby horse. If you want to ban the internet, then you're going to find any way to ban the internet you possibly can. This does not get to the main facts of the case, which is this was an institutional cover-up of child rape that was justified on the grounds of racial harmony. That is the actual fact of what's been going on here. And if you cannot address that, and clearly we still can't, many, many years after the first findings came out in the mainstream media, again, that was 2011, that the Andrew Norfolk Times cover first came out when people really started to realise what was going on. If all these years later, we still cannot openly all come up and stand up and say, this is actually what was happening here, then I do not think an inquiry is going to work. Particularly not when people now mainstream figures seem to be pretty comfortable in standing up and saying things like, you are far right if you acknowledge the reality that there was an ethnic component to these crimes. The Prime Minister is willing to say that now. The situation has clearly gotten much worse. So I think all an inquiry will do, it's a classic mechanism of the modern British state. It diffuses responsibility. It slows down the entire process, which diffuses public anger, and it essentially just sweeps things under the rug and goes, we won't have to think about that for 5 or 6 years, and by that time people would have forgotten and moved on to something else. A public inquiry is not what we need. It's woefully insufficient, and I would say to any politician on the right, a well-meaning politician, whatever end of the political spectrum you're on, do not put your political energies into getting an inquiry. Okay, you are just kind of digging your own grave here. Who do you think runs these inquiries? They are people like Dr. Ella Cockbain. Okay, I think it would be a very bad idea if that happened.
So we'll pick up on Summer in a second. But so you spoke about racial harmony there, and this was basically the idea, the cause for which many of these things went uninvestigated and unlooked at. And what does that say about the validity of this cause? I mean, we recently had, for instance, the historian Tom Holland drew a lot of criticism for his comments online saying that while the desire for racial harmony had led to terrible things in this case, it was nevertheless a noble cause. But it seems that in the context of the British state and what that actually means in practice, maybe this isn't such a good thing.
Well, this kind of comes from the problem of seeing racism as being like the foundational ultimate evil of everything. Racism is obviously evil and obviously bad, and race riots are horrific, and we should do as much as we possibly can to prevent them from happening. But that does not mean we should we should tell the police not to intervene in cases where children are being raped. I'm sorry, on the order hierarchy of things that are more important, preventing the rape of children is just obviously higher. There is nothing noble about those intentions. That is clearly mad. And anybody with a wit of common sense would be able to tell you that that is clearly mad. And that is, again, why it's so important to be able to talk about the kind of cultural aspects of these crimes. Because if you can't, you will end up kind of quietly having this little part of at the back of your head going, well, of course, I like to think as an outsider that I would have stood up and said something. But would you? Because, it could ruin your life. There were some people involved, Jane Senior, for example, who was one of the social workers dealing with some of the girls who'd been groomed. She was threatened. She was actually threatened in a veiled way, but she was kind of threatened by people who were working around her. There was an instance where her organisation, Risky Business, which had all the case files on the girls that had been groomed, was broken into by someone who must have had some way of getting into the building without her knowledge. There are all sorts of very dodgy, strange, almost conspiratorial aspects to these cases that would make actually even your normal upstanding citizen go, oh, I'm not sure I want to touch that actually. You'd have to be really, really, really brave to stand up in the face of this. And so that's why I don't think it is noble at all to think that the most important thing is to maintain racial harmony. I actually can't think of anything, if I am accepting the framing of the argument for a moment, that is more likely to upset racial harmony than accepting that some children will have to be raped in order to uphold the multicultural project. Like, that is insane. That is disgusting. And people who are very much in favour of Britain maintaining our multicultural structure have to reckon with that. I think it's very important these people can stand up and say openly, this was an atrocity. This is an ongoing atrocity, and it must be dealt with regardless of how it makes people feel. And if you cannot say that, then I'm sorry. I think that is just disgraceful. Honestly, I think it just discredits so much of what the British state is currently, basing its legitimacy on. And I think people who think the story is going to go away are hopelessly naive, to be honest with you. So yeah, I feel very, very, very strongly that we should not be using the language of the kind of, the greater good here, or, a noble cause. It is anything but a noble cause.
And so adjacent to this idea of promoting racial harmony is this idea of not giving succor to the far right. And so that was used, for instance, back in 2004 to stifle a Channel 4 documentary that included depictions of grooming gangs in Bradford, I think it was, because it was supposedly going to help the BNP at local elections. And as you were alluding to earlier, Keir Starmer was asked about this earlier this week, and he came out with this very ill-judged, that's perhaps a polite way of putting it, phrase, where he said that those calling for inquiry were jumping on a bandwagon of the far right. And it's just extraordinary. And then similarly, he talking about seemingly referring to Elon Musk. He talked about lies and disinformation or misinformation, whichever one it was, in reference to this. And Elon Musk has been tweeting a lot about this. But one of the things he had actually pinned to his X profile earlier in this week was, it absolutely was not lies or misinformation. It was a screenshot of a court transcript. I dare say you've seen it.
No, I know what you're referencing.
I won't repeat it here because it's absolutely horrific. That wasn't lies and misinformation, was it? And what did you make of Starmer's comments there?
I was furious. I think a lot of people. I was at work that day. I know a lot of people in the journalism business, even those who are actually pretty sympathetic at times to Keir Starmer, were absolutely gobsmacked that this was the line the government had decided to go with. There was not any contrition shown. There was no attempt to even put on a mask of sympathy for these horrific crimes that had happened and are still happening. It is immediately this strange playbook of, if people I don't like are saying something, regardless of the validity of it, it can be ignored because it is dangerous, and it emboldens these nebulous forces that are acting almost like miasma in the air, that are radicalizing other people, and that's too dangerous to properly countenance. And again, I'm sorry, this is just the same mindset that we have had in this country for decades now. It is the same mindset that allowed these crimes to first start happening. It is the same mindset that is allowing these crimes to continue to happen. I would also bring up on this term disinformation, misinformation, whichever you'd like to use. It's quite interesting. It was brought up a lot during the COVID pandemic. I think when people first started to go, there's something a bit weird about everybody saying disinformation at the same time. Morgan McSweeney, who is often brought up, he's Keir Starmer's chief of staff, often brought up as the kind of brains behind the Starmer project. Sometimes people kind of wink and nudge and say he's slightly more conservative, he's slightly more right-wing than a lot of people in the party. He actually helped set up this body called the Centre for Countering Online Disinformation. I may be getting the title slightly wrong.
Digital Hate, I think.
Digital Hate, yeah, there you go. And this was the same body that got a lot of hot water in America, because it was actually, it was a joint operation between British and American activists that was basically saying that we should censor the internet. In fact, one of their internal memos had something called "Kill Musk Twitter." That was actually one of their plans. So they wanted to destroy Elon Musk's goal of having a free speech online platform, because essentially they believe that free speech is just a mask for this dangerous force of disinformation. So these are people who are. It's actually explicitly post-liberal project. It is not one that accepts the liberal foundation of free speech at all. It is deeply suspicious of free expression, of free association, and it believes that there needs to be some kind of arm's length body that is regulating on behalf of the state. So this is kind of very baked into the ideology of Starmerism. I don't really think there was any way that Starmer could have responded to this crisis differently than he has already. It's not in his nature. He is a legalistic guy. He was head of the CPS. He thinks in terms of censorship, of legal censorship. It's not surprising that this is the route that he decided to go down. But it should make people angry, because it really is the mindset that allowed for the cover-up in these cases in the first place. Infantilizing authorities, they are beyond reproach. They cannot possibly be prosecuted for their role in this. We all have to be very nice to them. But on the other end, if you're saying something that is just true, that is something that's completely factually true, even in government-collected data, you can be harassed. You can have the full force of the law thrown at you. You can actually go to jail if you say it at the wrong time. And I think we have to be very clear that this is not the way a liberal state would act. This is not a liberal state. These are the forces of a sort of petty authoritarianism that is currently running the show in Britain at the moment.
And so finally, in terms of getting some action taken about this and potentially recovering from this awful episode in our history, obviously you take a dim view of an inquiry, but what are some of the political actions that the government should take, or that perhaps the Conservatives or Reform should call for here, do you think?
Well, I mean, if we do need some kind of inquiry, let's make it like the COVID inquiry. Let's have it filmed. Let's have all of the court transcripts out there. Let's have politicians hold before a panel of judges and have it televised, and have round-the-clock media coverage, asked about what they knew, why they didn't act, when they told the authorities about what they did know, have everything out in the open, go through people's texts, go through everything, all the archives, all the files. Reopen these cases, see if you can prosecute people again, see if we can change legal precedent to do this. Use the forces that were given to the British government by the Nationalities Act that came out under the Tory government to force deportations, even in a case where a country has denied to take someone back. So in the example of Pakistan, 1% of Pakistani GDP comes from UK remittances. If we said that you can have no remittances going back, that's a hell of a lot of money. I think they'd start moving pretty quickly. So that's one thing we can do as well. I would say it's very important to make sure that police officers and social workers who are involved in the most egregious elements of these crimes are prosecuted. I think that's really important, at the very least, that their names are released and that there's a thorough investigation, criminal investigation, into what they've been doing. These are just kind of off the top of my head, but they would have to be very strong, and they would have to be legal. They cannot just be lessons learned, it was all in the past. This has to be treated like it is, which is an ongoing crime. That's the kind of level. We have to treat it like a national emergency, like an ongoing national emergency, and that's the level of response that I want to see.
Okay, well, Poppy Coburn, thanks very much for coming on The Sceptic.
Thank you.
Now, we've talked a lot about the green blob on this show, and with its trillions of dollars of assets and the political backing of the great and the good, it's often seemed invincible. But last week, Morgan Stanley followed Citigroup and Bank of America in quitting the Net Zero Banking Alliance, a major part of the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, created in 2021. The bank insists it remains committed to the energy transition. But is the green finance bubble finally bursting? Well, to find out, I'm very pleased to be joined by Ben Pyle, who's a regular at The Sceptic and a journalist and commentator. Welcome back to The Sceptic, Ben.
Hi, Laurie. Good to be back. Thanks for having me.
Okay, so before we get into this discussion about ESG and the Net Zero Banking Alliance, let's just talk a bit about the general role of a bank in a capitalist system, because, there is a real social utility in what a bank is supposed to do, and that's allocating capital in useful and prudent ways and helping people manage risk and helping industry and enterprise, right? I mean, and generally speaking, Ben, that's an important role, isn't it?
Yeah, and capitalism has had a bad press, I think, in the past, from people who sort of imagine it to be just sort of robber barons who are sort of out there to, usuriously exploit people who need money. Actually, they make an awful lot of things possible.
That's the end of the free part of the podcast. If you'd like to listen to the bonus interview, you'll need to become a regular donor to the Daily Sceptic. For as little as £5 a month, not only will you be able to watch or listen to the whole podcast, You'll also be able to access articles behind our paywall and join our discussion forum on Discord, where you'll have an opportunity to discuss the latest content on the Daily Sceptic with other donors, members of the editorial team, and some of your favourite contributors. Once you've become a donor, log in to the Daily Sceptic using the same email, and you'll find a link to the premium version of the podcast on the homepage, including instructions about how to listen to it on your favourite podcasting app. Remember, you can access all this bonus content for as little as £5 a month. Just go to dailyskeptic.org/donate.